All right. Hello, all. I want to welcome you to the Vote Common Good webinar on the threat of Christian nationalism and what a faithful response could be. My name is Doug Pagitt. I'm the Executive Director of Vote Common Good. And I'm really thrilled that so many people have registered for the Zoom webinar for this conversation, and that many, many more are choosing to connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter and on YouTube, and want to be part of responding to the rise and the threat of Christian nationalism. Stephany, Spaulding, and I are going to be your hosts tonight. You're going to hear from Katherine Stewart, who has written a fantastic book on this topic called The Power Worshippers. You're going to hear from Pastor Michael Waters with a reflection. And those of you that are in the Zoom webinar, we're going to ask you to contribute as well. If you have questions, if you have comments, things you'd like to say, if you would raise your hand. Mary Beth is following along with us here, and she will be your host to keep track of all the questions that you have, and she will then private message with you inside the Zoom chat. If you're someone who's just watching on Facebook and on YouTube, on Twitter and Periscope and other places like Twitch, if you're following us on those spaces, look, if you want to interact with this, you can join us in the live webinar. So you want to do that next week, and you can go to votecommongood.com and you can click on registering for the webinar. Then you can connect to be able to interact with us during the course of our time. As I mentioned, Stephany Spaulding is with us. Stephany is a professor. She was a former candidate for Senate and for the House of Representatives in Colorado, and is a pastor. And so, Stephany, so glad to do this hosting with you tonight, and good to see you.
Likewise, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here always with you, and the conversations are just really rich and engaging. So you all are in for a treat tonight, and we just look forward to all that will unfold.
Stephany, would you give a little commentary about why this issue matters to you, the issue of Christian nationalism? I mean, I know for me, I've been a pastor for a long time and pastored a church that I started here in Minneapolis called Solomon's Porch for 20 years. And in those 20 years, we barely ever talked about Christian nationalism. Like, I knew Christian nationalism was a thing. I thought it was super fringy. I didn't think it warranted us talking about it as a collective community. I saw it as something that some people did, and let's not give it any more attention than it needs, and sort of let it just sit over in the corner and mind its own business over there and not be bothered. That's changed a lot. I'll say a bit more about why that's changed. And I'm running entire webinars for 4 weeks in a row, like we're doing tonight, on this topic, because it has struck me that it is a crucial part of what we're doing. But can you talk a little bit from your vantage point about how you've thought about Christian nationalism and what's brought you to be willing to host these 4 weeks along with me, and then next week with Christy Berghoff as well?
Absolutely. So I heard a lot about your story coming into Christianity later in life. But I was born and raised in the church, right? I don't remember a life, or there was no life for me that did not have congregation and faith and an understanding of God, Christ at the center of it. And so just part of my identity as a human being, so much is wrapped up into my understanding and relationship with who I know God to be. And that may not be the same across the board in a generic sense of when people utilize the term Christian, but it's essential. So essential that it's also a way in which my Blackness and womanness is shaped, right? So not really separable, and complex because of those intersections, right? And so growing up on the South Side of Chicago with this relationship in community and personally, my knowing of who I am is deeply rooted by the understand. In the same way, I would argue that individuals understand themselves to be Jewish. Some individuals who understand themselves to be Jewish. And so when I moved to Colorado, specifically Colorado Springs, in 2010, as a full adult, and having had decades of relationship with Christian identity, both in in Chicago and Atlanta and across the country and other places where I lived, there was a different energy to how people even receive the identity of Christian, right? So the very first people that I came in relationship with as colleagues are Jewish. And they let me stay in their house until I got an apartment. And they were like, we love Christians. It's just them Christians that we really have trouble with. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. But being rooted in Colorado Springs with a particular kind of relationship to Christian nationalism and ultra evangelical conservative Christianity, really became a challenge for me and my own personal faith and identity. And then running for office in a place like that, where thinking politically, I was too Christian for progressives and not Christian enough for religious folks, right? And that complication. And so I just feel over, the last 10 years or so that there's a hijacking of even what it means to walk in Christian faith and to have a relationship with God in this way. And there's a pastoral and communal reclamation that has to happen in response to this hijacking by Christian nationalism.
Wow. Yeah. Amen to all of that. And, we have been reminded, and you have helped me to see that sometimes referring to this only as Christian nationalism without pointing out that it's white Christian nationalism that we're talking about is crucial. And I really do believe that that's the case. And one of the reasons that I'm going to give a lot of energy to this in the work we're doing with Vote Common Good and want to be a public voice is because I live in the space as a middle-aged white male pastor. And so often it's been people who are in the groups that I'm in that have remained quiet while Christian nationalism, and we're going to find out tonight that at least from the perspective of Katherine Stewart, who is an expert in this field, suggests that it's a very small number of people who really identify with Christian nationalism, but it has an influence that is much larger than its size. Now, one of the things we want to be careful of in the webinar, and each one of our 4 weeks are going to be different. Each one will have their own experience. Each one will have their own guests, their own experts. Each one's going to have its own style and vibe to it. We want to make sure that you're moved through the range and the dynamism that exists around Christian nationalism. But we also want to make sure that this doesn't become overly academic. The reason that we've offered this as a faithful response to individuals, to communities, to pastors, is because we really do believe that this is about how people are experiencing the world they live in. For me, January 6th was one of those days where I recognized that Christian nationalism was a disease that was causing a harm in this country much greater than I had understood. It wasn't that the disease started on January 6th. It was that the diagnosis was made clear on January 6th. And part of it is what I saw of the prayer that the insurrectionists prayed when they broke in to the Senate dais. There was a video shot by a reporter from the New Yorker who I'm so glad was there because he recorded this video and it was shared. And what these men, and they all happened to be men that were in this space, prayed is the greatest clarity and articulation of Christian nationalism. I'm going to play the video for you here in a moment. Maybe you've seen it already, and so you know to brace yourself. For those who haven't seen it before, I will just say it's a little shocking. The clarity and the boldness that these insurrectionists are taking over the Capitol. They're inside the Senate chamber. They're up on the Senate dais. One of the people you will recognize who has been arrested by the FBI and is going to be prosecuted for his crimes of insurrection on that day is one often referred to as the QAnon shaman. This is the man with the horns and the sleeveless fur vest. He's the one that's there, and he leads a prayer The words of the prayer are an articulation of Christian nationalism. So hear them over. We're recording this. You'll have a chance to hear them later. You can look this video up on YouTube if you want to watch in your own time to see it again. It's a riveting moment and shows the view of Christian nationalism. Now, I do want to say this. Not every Christian nationalist is going to want to lead a violent, deadly insurrection against our government and then stand in the dais and pray this prayer. But this would be the content that so many people who, while they disagree with the means by which these people were leading their insurrection, they agree with the sentiment. And this is what has motivated this webinar tonight and so many others. So here it is. It's about a minute long. And I'll just say again, draw your attention to it and pay as close of attention as you can to what's going on and the words that are spoken. So here it is.
All the way back to the monument. All the way.
Jesus Christ, we spoke your name. Amen. Amen. Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Let me take it back. Thank you, Heavenly Father. Amen. For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs. That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen. Amen.
So there it is. If you've ever wondered what a Christian nationalist would pray, they would pray that this country belongs to us and not to others, that it belongs to those who profess Christ and not to others, that the others are the enemies that we will drive out. Now, there are some Christian nationalists who will approach the world with a much more generous spirit, that it is our country and we are the ones who will be in charge, and we will be kind and gracious and benevolent to you. Whether you want to drive out the globalists and you want to drive out your opponents and call them traitors with violence, or you want to be accommodating to all who differ from you, if your root is the nature of that prayer, that you see this as belonging to you in Christ's name, then you represent Christian nationalism. Everything about it, the flags that are being held, the prayer that's being prayed, the screaming of Jesus's name as the authority by which they operate. Mm-hmm. This is not just an insurrection narrative. This is actually something that is riddled through our country and is happening in our communities. And there are many people who believe this kind of teaching, and they want to be more kind and they want to be more gracious about how they execute this belief, but it is their belief. And I'll tell you that as a pastor, I haven't known what to do with people who say this. I'll just simply try to say, this country is not just a Christian country. This country wasn't founded as a Christian country. And to all of that, people have a retort and a pushback. So this has been a difficult conversation for our country to have from its founding. There have been people making the same argument that those insurrectionists are arguing for on January 6th of 2021. They've been making this argument all along, and others who've been arguing differently. This is a perpetual question in the United States of America. Stephany, any responses that you have to that devastating?
Yeah, I think that this is such a insidious, idea that the politicization of Christianity, right? That one, God is centrally involved in the establishing of a nation state called the United States of America, right? That God's divineness is connected to a particular ideological and national identity, that that God is not a part of any other human operation. They call out communism, socialism, and liberal thought, and all of these other things, that God is separate from the construct of anything other than what we see as this particular U.S. democratic republic that has been established, and that it is part of their responsibility, right? That the law enforcement agents were smart, wise, and kind enough to grant them access to the dais, because it is their responsibility to reclaim. And so whether or not we find ourselves to be in this particular group, as you have pointed out, that violently and to the extremes have gone into the Capitol to undermine the authority of the government that is established for their particular agenda. When we speak and preach or are silent about talking about this nation's identity tied to a specific religious perspective that is Christianity, and I would argue very intersectionally white Christianity, that when we are, as pastors, silent in that conversation, or even perpetuating to say things that, and I'll just give another example, and hopefully none of us have ever said anything like this, but when we tell immigrants to speak English, right? When in reality, there is no national language. The United States of America does not have a national language, but the perception is that English and English only is the language of the country, right? It's the same kind of insidiousness that exists in the ether, in the air, the very air that we breathe, when we aren't speaking and correcting the record and articulating that the national identity of this country is not rooted in a particular religious worldview.
Wow, so well said. Stephany and I are going to be your hosts tonight, and we had a conversation with our content provider. Her name is Katherine Stewart. Katherine is the author of the book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It's a book that came out a year ago. It was released on March 3rd, 2020. She is someone who's been looking at the rise of religious nationalism. And each of our content providers for each of the week bring a unique perspective. For Katherine Stewart, she's a journalist, and we asked her at the beginning of the interview, which we'll play for you in a moment, why she got into this. She has her own personal journey that brought her into this. As a person who's in the Jewish faith and a journalist, she became interested in Christian nationalism, not from the pastoral side where we find ourselves, or like our guests next week are going to be, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. They come out as sociologists, or as our content provider in 2 weeks, Amanda Taylor, who runs Christians Against Christian Nationalism effort and website. She's an activist, or the historian who's going to join us on April 27th. Her name is Kristen Dumais, and she's written a book called Jesus and John Wayne. Each one of these experts in this area of Christian nationalism have their own pathway into it. For Katherine, she came into it as a journalist and has studied it, and she's become one of the world's foremost experts. In fact, in the last year, this book has captured a lot of people's attention. I would recommend it to you highly. You'll see the cover of it, and you hear the title a few more times. It's called The Power Worshippers. And what you're going to hear from her is both her expertise and her insights into what's happening. This is going to run about 27 minutes, this interview. It's worth every minute of it. I was in it and then got to edit it and watch it. It's really, really great. After that, we're going to have a chance for you to respond. So if questions have come up from what we've been talking about so far or what you hear from Katherine, write those in the chat, raise your hand. Mary Beth will facilitate those. And then when we come out of the video interview, you'll hear from one another about the questions and comments you have before we hear a great piece from Pastor Michael Waters tonight. So get your questions ready. Get ready to be engaged by Katherine Stewart and her book. And here is that interview. So Katherine, you wrote this book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And it's a curious book for you to write. Will you tell us a bit about why you wrote the book and what the context was for you and why this seemed important to write it?
Sure. Well, about 12 years ago, I was living in Santa Barbara, California, with my husband and kids. Our daughter was 6 years old. And I found out through some other moms that a Good News Club was coming to our public elementary school. First I thought, sounds like great news. And I found out they were teaching Bible study from a non-denominational standpoint. I suppose I was a bit naive. I thought non-denominational meant non-sectarian. And look, I'm a big free speech supporter. And I also think you can teach about the Bible, even in public schools, from a non-sectarian standpoint, as history or literature, things like that. I actually took a Bible course when I was in public school as a child and found it really useful and interesting. But, I started to hear stories from other families in town whose kids attended public schools where these Good News Clubs had been established. They only established themselves in elementary schools, targeting kids in the very first years of learning. And I started to hear about how kids attending the clubs were targeting their peers for what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry. A little girl that we knew was approached on a playground by a friend who was attending a Good News Club and said, "You don't believe in Jesus, so you're going to go to hell." And our friend's daughter said, "That's not true." And they sort of started to get into a discussion. And the teacher overheard this dispute, and she said, different faith traditions have different perspectives on these issues. And our friend's daughter was fine with that. But the other little girl started to cry, and she was really upset. She said, "I know it must be true because they taught it to me in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true." And that really, was shocking to me. Anyone who's had little kids or has worked with them knows very well that they cannot distinguish between an activity that's taking place in their school from one that is sponsored by their school. Public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of little children, especially. So, a group of parents in our school who are affiliated with the local evangelical college, Westmont College, actually offered the Good News Club leaders free and better space in this beautiful church next door to our school. You could just walk over, I don't know, maybe 40 yards away, 30 yards away. And the Good News Club leaders declined. And, our friends who were part of this group of moms, they were like, we're Christians too. We believe in the Great Commission. You're just not right for our school. And we just want to offer you this free space. And I just sort of, when the Good News Club leaders declined, that's when I started to ask some questions. I thought, who are the people behind the Good News Clubs? And what do they really believe? And why don't they want to be at the Montecito Covenant Church? Why do they need to be in the public school? And that, I sort of started to learn more about the club. And I realized as I did that the Good News Clubs, which are sponsored by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship, were really just sort of one small part of a larger attack on public education. There's just a tremendous amount of hostility toward public schools and toward public education within that organization. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the attack on public education was really just one small part of a larger attack on America as a modern constitutional republic. And so I just, published a book in 2012 about Good News Clubs and the larger attack on public education efforts to both infiltrate public schools and programming, and also undermined public education altogether. And I just kept sort of digging deeper over the years. And so The Power Worshippers, my current book, is really the culmination of about a dozen years of research in this area.
And I'm just really curious, Katherine, when you say young children, are we talking like first grade kindergartners or a little bit older?
Yeah, absolutely. Children who are too young to read, actually, the centerpiece of the Good News Club's program is called The Wordless Book. It has no words, just shapes and colors and pictures, and it's used to convert children who are too young to read to a very kind of a very specific and fairly reactionary form of the Christian faith. And when I was researching Good News Clubs, I went to their national convention. I attended Good News Clubs from coast to coast. I went through part of a training period, and they really have a very specific interpretation of the Christian faith, which we know is has a lot of different. It's very diverse, and so it was. There are a lot of families I met in the course of my research were themselves Christians, but they decided to send their kids up to Good News Clubs because it's so convenient. It's right in the public school. And the kids would come home and say, Mommy, Daddy, we're going to go to hell because we don't go to the right kind of church.
We've talked about that there's a difference between being a conservative Christian and Christian nationalism. So can you talk a bit about what Christian nationalism is particularly, and why you recognize that it is such a problem and such a threat in the United States?
Sure. Let's talk about what Christian nationalism is, and let's talk about what it is not. The first thing to know is it's not Christianity or even a religion at all, properly speaking. It's a political ideology, and its representatives insist that the foundation of legitimate government is bound up with a reactionary understanding of the Christian faith. It basically says that the United States is founded on the Bible, and that our country can only succeed if it stays true to this foundation. It's also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating large segments of the population by getting them to vote for the political candidates that the movement favors, and basically for creating a new elite, concentrating power in the hands of a new leadership cadre of people who subscribe to illiberal ideologies. It's important to know that it's a leadership-driven movement. It's not sort of bottom-up. It's not driven by the rank and file. It's a top-down movement. I want to say something else about what the movement is not. It is not just about evangelicals. It includes some evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals, including some white evangelicals and most evangelicals of color. And it also includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. Ultra-conservative Catholics, in particular, have become a critical element, and the movement actually even derives support from individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. What unites them is not a distinct theology, but a common political vision.
So a lot of us have become concerned about these issues because of what we saw on January 6th, when people in the name of Christianity and Christian nationalism attacked the United States Capitol in order to prevent the free and fair election being certified. That was a consciousness awakener for a lot of us. But you wrote this book and have been doing this research long before that. So you saw it as a concern in the U.S., not just noticing that there's people who view the world this way, but you were really noticing that it's a problem in the United States. Can you talk a bit about why you see it as a threat, as a real problem?
Sure. Look, Christian nationalism is damaging to both faith and the nation. By fusing Christianity with partisanship, it damages both the political system and also religion. The political damage is in some ways easier to see. I think by locking in a base of voters around a small number of absolute non-negotiable positions, such as abortion is the most obvious one, right? The one political party, the Republican Party, has effectively taken conservative Christians hostage and then uses them to advance its many other agendas unchecked and basically, boil down all of the complex problems of our society end up being reduced to the issue of abortion. And so if you get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote and enact a much broader agenda, many policies that they aren't aware of. And this hostage taking also licenses the corruption of political leaders. I mean, for example, there was nothing that our former president, Trump, could not steal or taint as long as he appointed those pro-life judges. But, I think the damage to religion, frankly, doesn't get enough attention. This kind of politicized religion becomes incredibly binary in that it demonizes political opponents and it deifies its favored political leaders. It's also really inevitably doomed to frustration and failure because it's tying its religious or eternal aspirations to political developments in the here and now. I mean, look, we have a very diverse nation. None of us are going to get everything we want all the time. And politics works best when we can do a sort of give and take, right? And compromise and coalition building. But, in the face of these inevitable losses in the political arena, which are really inevitably going to happen in a society as pluralistic as ours, leaders of the movement are likely to adopt and spread a very embittered and nihilistic view of the world, which has the potential for leading to the kind of radicalization that we saw on January 6th.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier to really hone in on the alienation of some white Christians and by and large BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color who are Christians. So are you suggesting that Christian nationalism is white by and large for the most part? And as a political ideology, is it just a political ideology existing in the United States, or can we find Christian nationalism in New Zealand or, elsewhere?
Oh my gosh, those are such important questions, and I want to get to both of them. So let's start with the first one. There's absolutely no question that the movement has deep roots in racism, but the relationship is complex. There's a smaller but growing segment of the movement that is not white, including a subsection of leadership. But that doesn't, and we can talk about how that relates to the international picture later, but that doesn't nullify the fact that Christian nationalism in America often promotes highly racialized narratives about culture and heritage. I think for a lot of the white people in the movement, it's an implicitly white. It's implicitly white in that it ties the idea of America to certain, racial and religious identities. But here's where it matters or tremendous. This is one example of how this really matters. The movement is driving support for a political party that has made race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression a strategic imperative. Now, and that's really important today. I just read there's something like 361 voter suppression bills in 47 states, which disproportionately affect people of color. Many people are calling this a new Jim Crow. It's just, it's disgusting, but frankly, the support for voter disenfranchisement is not all that surprising, considering the theological ancestors of today's religious authoritarians who wielded the Bible in support of slavery and segregation. I talk about that quite a bit in my book, The Power Worshippers. There are a number of pro-slavery theologians who were not just in the South, but some in the North as well. I mean, in the South, we had people like James Henry Thornwell, Robert Louis Dabney. In the North, we had John Henry Hopkins and Wilbur Fisk. They had either made their peace with slavery or actively supported it. In Power Worshippers, I described this sort of conflict between the abolitionist theologians, I write about a dozen of them, and the pro-slavery theologians. But, as Frederick Douglass said, the ministers of high standing were almost twice a man on the side of slavery, the sort of, wealthy, well-funded pastors at that time, ministers at that time. And he said that their churches, so far from being rebuked as an offender, the slaveholder was received and welcomed as a saint. So here's where this matters today. I mean, you could just look at this as a sort of dispute from the past, but those pro-slavery theologians, like Christian nationalist thought leaders today, were intensely hostile to the principles of equality, pluralism, and critical thinking. Some of them were hostile to physical sciences. They endorsed an austere biblical literalism and these rigid hierarchies, which they said were ordained by God. And they sort of had this idea that America is a Christian nation chosen by God, that it should be an Orthodox Christian republic, and that at some point it sort of deviated from its mission horribly and fell under the control of atheist and or liberal elites. I mean, this all sounds a little familiar. Okay, I want to read you a quote. Is that okay? Can I do that?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Great. It's from James Henry Thornwell. He was a leader of the Southern Presbyterian Church. So here's what he said. The parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, socialists, communists on the one side, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. And we hear this today. I remember it was like, it's like anyone who fails to sort of affirm their agenda as an atheist and a socialist and a communist. I remember at the Republican National Convention where Donald Trump Jr. said something like, this is a battle between work, church, and school, and chaos and marauding on the other side. But this is something that the movement leaders do. They, I've unfortunately heard a lot of sort of demonization of their people who have different opinions of them. And it points to the fact that this is a really authoritarian movement. I think that's really underappreciated. The ideology of religious nationalism is anti-democratic, it's anti-pluralistic, and it's any political leader, to their minds, who is not in line with their agenda is completely illegitimate, because to them, legitimacy derives not from free and fair elections or from consent of the governed or the democratic process, but from accordance with their vision for our country, which they say comes from God and the Bible.
And just to clarify for those, again, who are listening, that anti-democratic is not anti-democratic party, even though that becomes part of it. It's anti-government ruled by the people, right? By a majority, right?
Absolutely, Stephany. And, you asked another question about America's religious nationalists and whether this is just like an American problem. Absolutely not. There's really nothing exceptional about America's Christian nationalism. It's really garden variety religious nationalism. I use the term religious nationalism in the subtitle of my book to make that clear, to make clear its similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the world, where leaders are forming and I describe some of that in the book as well. Leaders are forming close alliances with religious conservatives to solidify a more authoritarian form of political power. So when we see leaders like Orban in Hungary or Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey bind themselves to conservative religious leaders to consolidate a more authoritarian form of government, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. It's really a kind of identity politics. But, this is what right-wing authoritarians often do.
Do you feel like a lot has changed since January 6th? I mean, other than you now being on more podcasts and Zoom calls and live streams and webinars than you probably ever thought this topic would raise, but has something changed in the consciousness of people being aware? And has something changed in the hardened commitment of Christian nationalists in the United States?
I think people are more aware, but I think that something that's still underappreciated is how coordinated all of this stuff is happening, at a pretty high level. I mean, think about the January 6th, the groundwork was really laid by these organizations such as the Council for National Policy, which includes leaders of a lot of these groups. Again, this is a leader-driven movement. And they were really instrumental in preparing the ground for the assault by feeding the conspiracy narrative of a stolen election. So, the Conservative Action Project, which is associated with the Council for National Policy, demanded investigations of these sort of spurious and baseless allegations of election fraud. But one thing that's changed is that the movement has really shifted to a new front. Many of the individuals and groups that were sort of behind this sort of narrative, the stolen election and election fraud, are now all in for voter suppression. Mm-hmm. So this is another example of sort of high-level coordination of the movement. 361 bills is the latest number in 47 states. One of the features of the movement is one of the sort of features of their activity is a centrally manufactured legislation. They sort of follow the bill mill model, where there's sort of, it's a very centralized movement. It consists of a variety of for-profit, nonprofit organizations, legal advocacy groups, policy groups, legislative initiatives, data organizations, and they sort of all act in concert. And, one of the things that they have done in the past and they're doing now is to sort of overwhelm state legislatures with bills based on centrally manufactured legislation. So often these bills, they come into the states, they appear to be these sort of siloized initiatives driven by local politicians and personalities, but they're not. They're drafted and rolled out as part of a centrally coordinated plan. And that is a feature of the movement's machinery. So they're really effective in that fashion. And often people don't recognize when these types of bills come in. They're like, oh, this is just something that our state is dealing with, and it's not. The voting rights in particular, I just want to say, sorry to interrupt, Stephany, it just represents a direct impact on our electoral system, which is the foundation of our democracy.
I guess I just want to, like so many others, and seriously at our dinner table, just having this conversation with my father, how are they so effective in organizing? Because my father is screaming at, CNN, MSNBC, whatever news station, ABC, whatever is on. And he's just like, why can't the counter people get it together? How and why are these people so organized in their effective in their organizing, to the point that it doesn't even look like they have organized?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's effective because they've been investing for decades in all of the features of modern campaign infrastructure, including data and media and messaging. This isn't just, these are people with really long-term vision. And one of the leaders I wrote about in the Power Worshippers, David Barton, he said, one of his writings, arm yourself with the mentality of the distance runner, not the sprinter. So the movement consists of, religious right policy groups, networking groups. There's a whole right-wing legal sphere, a terrarium with legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Council, and others. There's a Federalist Society, of course, which plays an enormous role in grooming and promoting justices, data organizations, and the like. And they just, so there's, we can't overlook also the effect of the far right propaganda sphere in sort of getting the rank and file on board. And I mean, one of the things that they're so effective, that makes them so effective, is that they've persuaded people to vote on just a few issues. If you can get those people to vote on those sort of culture war issues like abortion or same-sex marriage and the like, or LGBT issues, you can control their vote. So they, they sort of are very good at picking these sort of binary issues in a way, reducing all of, all of the complex problems of the world to these issues where there is a sort of clear yes or no answer, seemingly clear yes or no answer. But, when we're talking about the rank and file, we're talking about a really wide range of people with a variety of different opinions and ideas and approaches. So when a lot of them end up voting to say, end abortion, they are really not arguing for major changes in the way our government is run. They're really kind of making a statement about themselves and what they value in themselves. But it's really the leaders of the movement that are kind of directing the action.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. When you interviewing all the people you've talked to, and then I'm sure people, since the book has come out and you've become an expert in this field, are leaders that you're talking to, are they comfortable being called Christian nationalists? Like, do they wear that as a statement of pride and as an agreed upon way to describe what they do? And also individuals that you've met, like, do people go around saying, no, I support Christian nationalism. I think this was a Christian country from its foundation. I want it to return to that. And I want the laws that we have now to be rooted in the scriptures of the Judeo-Christian narrative. Is that what you're hearing? Is it that straightforward and blunt from leaders and from other peoples?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I use a lot of different terms in my writing. I use the term religious nationalism in the title because my book does also have an international component. I use the terms religious right, Christian nationalist sometime. I think that all those terms can be used appropriately depending on context, but I often think Christian nationalism is a more accurate term because to many people, the term religious right suggests a position in the culture wars, a kind of social movement arising from the ground up. And the term Christian nationalism makes clear that this is not just about the culture wars, and it points to the fact that this is really a distinctively political movement, and it aims to achieve political power. It's not just a sort of position in the culture wars. I also think that there's really some ambiguity in the term right when we use the term Christian right or religious right, although I use those terms at times. But here's the thing, the term right suggests that it's a conservative movement, and Christian nationalism is not a conservative movement in my mind. It's a radical movement. I think as the Trump era made clear, blindingly clear at times, it involves support for policies, anti-democratic policies that are not necessarily or even remotely conservative. I think that a truly conservative movement would prize voting, which is like the foundation of our democracy. It would prize the integrity of the judiciary. It would seek to preserve public schools, which after all educate 90% of American school children. It would seek to preserve institutions of value that have served us so well and kept a pluralistic country together for imperfectly, of course, but even as so many others have been torn apart by sectarian division.
So again, you spoke to the data readers and collectors and the message machines and the lawyer guilds, and who is paying for this? Where's the money coming from?
There's a lot of money involved. The movement has three sources of funding. The first is the movement gets a lot of funding from a subset of very wealthy plutocrats, members of often very hyper-wealthy extended families. Just off the bat, I think about the Prince DeVos family, the Wilkes brothers, so many others that I write about in Power Worshippers, many of whom are interestingly as interested, if not more interested, in sort of free market, fundamentalist, I say, like hyper-libertarian economic policies as they are in right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. But some of them, know that they don't have a hope of getting, deregulation for business that they want, and the ability to sort of continue to amass the incredible fortunes in quite the same unfettered way that they do without those policies. So they happy to push the culture wars because they end up getting people to vote for economic policies that are intensifying economic inequality. So that's one source. Second source is small dollar donations from the rank and file. A lot of the organizations like the Family Research Counselor, Americans, Students for Life, groups like that are, spend a lot of their energy seeking small dollar donations. And the third source of their funding is actually public money. A lot of the movement their activity is determined to not only secure but increase the amount of public funding that they get through not only tax subsidies and grants and vouchers and things like that, but they're also seeking to sort of expand in some ways those sources of public funding.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating conversation, wasn't it? I hope that you enjoyed it. Stephany, it was fun to re-listen to it again, wasn't it? And to hear all that was going on.
Absolutely, yes.
Look, if you have a question or comment about any of this, would you put it in the chat? And if you'd like to raise that question and come on with your video or put your voice on, raise your hand, and Mary Beth who's managing that part of the Zoom interaction, will engage with you. Stephany, there were two questions that I know came through and Mary Beth sent over here. One of them I think is really helpful. It was from an anonymous attendee, interestingly. And the person wrote, how do you talk to people you love who are Christian nationalists in love and break through the hate and the division? I feel so separated by certain friends and family members. I mean, boy, if any question sort of gets right at the heart of it, where a lot of us are, right, knowing we're not going to solve for all of Christian nationalism, but is there something we can do? Do you have any thoughts on that? That very insightful anonymous question.
I think it's like so many other polarizing questions, especially or concepts, right? Whether we're talking about white supremacist ideology, privilege, and oppression. I think we have to first find the space that is common ground, what we can agree on, and take note and measure of where you are and where you are not willing to go in the conversation in the most loving and open way that you can do that. What I mean by that is there are some conversations that I am not going to have with certain people because I know that they are not ready to receive it. And that comes from my perspective as an educator, right? I am not going to dive into graduate level material with folks who are just coming out of high school, So there's some scaffolding that has to be done in that. And also a commitment or an assessment of the level of commitment that you're willing to energize or put towards that conversation. And then also it's a release. I think the third piece of that is a release in knowing that as much of the conversation you can have, there is no way that you are going to shift or change anybody else's mind. That is an internal, individualized place and decision that we all get to make for ourselves, right? So when I am having these conversations, I don't come at it from I'm trying to persuade you and that I need to see the evidence of that persuasion. It is simply, this is what I know. This is what I know to be true. And this is what I'm learning. If you choose to receive it, almost very biblically, for those who have ears to hear, let them hear.
Wow. So wise. We have a couple of people that raised their hands. So Michael Hamblin, we're going to go to you first. I'm going to click allow you to talk, and I'm just going to promote you to a panelist. So maybe you've done this before, but we'd love to have a chance to hear from you. So Michael, what are your comments?
Yeah, I just really wanted to kind of get the take from Stephany and maybe from you too, Doug. I have to tell you, when I talk to people, they just really seem like they're just really locked into their way of thinking. There's a certain, I hate to use the word brainwashing, but it's so hard to break through this. And I guess I'm trying to say, where can I start with when I'm talking to people? How can I break them out of this? And what is it that is the thing? What's the hook that really brings them into it? And how can we find that? That's what I just wanted to see what your thoughts were and how we can bridge that conversation better.
Michael, thank you so much. Thanks for being on the webinar for the question. Stephany, you want to take another stab at it?
I would, if unfortunately I could have heard Michael.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot to tell you that the Michael, Stephany can't hear the questions. I have to repeat them to her. Michael was reiterating this. Like, is there some way to break through? People feel almost brainwashed. They feel stuck. They feel like the people just don't see or think in any different way. Is there some other way that people can engage with this this kind of issue so that they can?
So I think part of what we learned from Katherine is, one, the fact that people feel brainwashed is intentional, because in some regards, that is what's happening. The dumbing down of the nation is a very critical part of advancing this kind of agenda and agendas like it, right? There's intentional work that has happened to the point that the less intellectual and critical thinking, I don't mean to greed, right? But the less that people critically think, the more or the less democratic the society is in and of itself. And when I say democratic, I mean, again, you have a plurality of ideas and a diversity of people who are leading in that way and engaged in the political process. So to Michael's point, that's absolutely correct, that a lot of people do feel brainwashed because we are being brainwashed. The one thing that I do encourage my students and even congregants is to seek information from alternative sources that will help triangulate information, right? When we look at our media sources in the United States today, most of them come from three major conglomerates of media content creators. So that in and of itself is highly problematic, because we're just getting recycled narratives over and over and over again, whether it's Viacom or Clear Channel or Disney, right? So those are like the major players, and they own all of the stations. So finding alternative but reputable sources, you see it more often in international space than in U.S. space, where local newspapers are very much well-resourced and checked, and to match that information against itself. Definitely not the echo chamber of your social media feed.
Yeah, that's really well said, Stephany. And I'll say, Michael, there's this old adage that I learned back when I was a youth pastor, which was, kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You remember that sort of saying? It seems a little cloak, a little hokey and all, but it's kind of true. Look, one of the things that the religious right and the Christian nationalists have used is a notion that they care about faith. And they talk about it. Now, they're using it, they're perverting it and everything, but they talk about it. So one of the things that I think we can do in these conversations is say to people, we think our faith matters and we think our civic life matters, and we're negotiating how those come together. And then to offer to someone that you're concerned, that you have really deep concerns about how some people are putting those together. People don't even know that the equation that they've worked out in their own thinking is not the only option. There are just a lot of people who, if they even watched this webinar, they would be learning things they didn't know before. They didn't know that there was another option. They have only been told since they went to Christian school or they heard it in Sunday school that this is a Christian nation from the Pilgrims right through Donald Trump, right? And every once in a while we have presidents that take us over awry, and sometimes we're brought back home. And this is what they've been told. So it's what they know. Sometimes just breaking in with some new information to the people who know that you care about them, and you care about the issues that they care about. It really does go a long way. But I think we're to a place, and one of the questions that Bruce Rosen put here is said there's a vacuum into which Christian nationalism has entered, he wrote in the chat. Can any of you say something about the disappearance of civic education and in public schools and how this is or not handled in parochial and private schools? And I think Bruce is onto something here, that there's just an awful lot of people who've only ever heard one narrative. This is why I've been so encouraged by the people who've gone well ahead of Vote Common Good and doing the great work, and the people you're going to hear about, so that we can all realize, oh boy, there's a lot of work we have to do. And having been silent for too long about these issues, it's no wonder. It almost brings to me to mind the teachings or the act of Jesus when he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Right? There's a real empathic understanding there that sometimes people just really don't know. Now, some people need to wake up. Absolutely, obviously. But as my friend Rabbi Sharon Brose said in a meeting about this topic, she said, there's no alarm clock loud enough to awaken someone from a fake sleep. So there are some people that are just fake sleeping, right? They know they're not sleeping. They know this Christian nationalism thing. They're the leaders that Katherine talked about and others. But then there's some people who they really don't know. So if you feel like you're running into somebody who's fake sleeping and they don't want to hear and they don't want to talk about it, I don't know, knock the dust off your sandals and move on to someone else and don't disturb what's there. But there's an awful lot of people that I trust. They just don't really know. They really don't know, and they really don't understand.
I would also offer to Bruce's point that there is a lack of civic education that's happening in our public school settings, where it is very different in some of our charter and parochial settings, and why this 4-week series is so important, because to the opposite of a fake sleep or what have you, pastorally, and I think particularly in white evangelical, and I'm not talking ultra conservative, I just mean evangelical Protestant congregations, tend to run and hide from civic discourse and civic engagement. When and this is not the same as Christian nationalists, but this is a history of the role of faith and how it played out in the advancing of human dignity and decency in Black community, in Latinx community, right? That as a child, not only did I know who God was, but I also knew what a clipboard and a petition was, because we were so taught to think about our role in community and in society at such a young age. And again, the tendency has become that because the bad Christians have hijacked the politics of the moment, that in order to be a good Christian, I need to really fall back on that church and state, and that is, it has been to the detriment, I will say, of a number of communities.
That is excellent. Hey, we're gonna Mary Blessing. I don't know if you still have a comment. If you do, we're just gonna allow you to share it here. And we see there's a few more comments that we're not gonna have time to get to. Oh, I think Mary put her hand down. So I think Mary did not want to share that. But Mary, thank you for being interested in doing so. If somebody else has their hand up, okay, I think maybe Mary's back. I feel like I'm running a radio show. This is awesome.
Oh, hi. This is Mary. I did want to say it.
Thank you.
So, hi. Just full disclosure. I'm an ordained Episcopal priest. And I am in a denomination that thinks of itself as out of the Anglican tradition, very broad in receiving lots of different theological interpretation. One of the things that's really been disturbing to me under the Trump administration's influence over Christianity, and I know it was there before, but became such a clear, we couldn't ignore it anymore thing, is that there are some Episcopalians who have a conservative capitalist perspective. So they feel that the United States is the place on the planet where people could come with nothing. Of course, it does. These are usually, actually, all the people I'm talking about are white, mostly male, and definitely affluent people. So they have a theological belief. They really believe that God gave this land to those people who were not free to have a certain kind of religion in their other country, came here and were given the land and given this opportunity to have capitalism build their wealth, and anybody else who's willing to work hard to get their wealth. Now, I don't think Stephany can hear me, so my question is, how do you address somebody to point out capitalism is not Jesus' philosophy of life? That capitalism, being at our foundation, isn't even necessarily what our constitutional foundation intended. You see what I mean? There's the common good and the well-being of all people is what democracy, what democratic republic intended, which doesn't mean you get the free market. And that Katherine Stewart person was saying a huge portion of these so-called free market deregulator people will take the abortion or gay rights issue or something else and make it okay to be on this platform so they can get their free market, non-regulated marketing thing going. And it's contrary to Jesus.
Mary Blessing, thank you. That was excellent. I will simply say this: in 2 weeks, on the 20th of April, our conversation is going to include that. So I hate to put off.
I'll be back. But if you can share with Stephany, I'd like her.
Just one of those. That's not just one of those. Hey, this brings somebody back. But the way we're going to structure out our conversations and what's moving forward is this first day here is to talk about the basics of Christian nationalism, which we can all feel, and then we're going to move forward to the other weeks. In fact, I'll just let you know who our guests are going to be. Next week, it's going to be Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They've written a book called "Taking America Back for God: Christian Nationalism in the United States." This is not a how-to manual. It's a sociologist's take on what's going on. So be sure that you understand it that way. And then on the 20th, the day I'm talking about, Christians Against Christian Nationalism director Amanda Tyler is going to be one of our content providers that day, and some other guests. And we're going to talk specifically about this. What's the alternative to the narrative that Mary was just raising about capitalism and the promise of this nation and how people talk about it? So some of the history of how we got here is going to be the conversation there. And then on April 27th, Kristen Dumais is the author of Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And so she's going to talk about some of the issues moving forward from there. So those are going to be our coming weeks. We know that it's hard to wait between all the weeks. Those of you that are watching this on recording, you can just, when we're all done with these weeks, you can just jump from one video to the next. Be sure that you do. I'll also mention we're going to play here Michael's our final bit for the night, Pastor Michael Waters, with a beautiful admonition for us going out for tonight. But we're going to take the content that comes here, great questions like what Mary raised there and what Michael raised and what you heard from Christian Stewart and others. And we're going to put this into some packaging so that you can use this for groups that you're in. You can have some shorter questions, maybe some video curriculum, and a number of other groups, including Christians Against Christian Nationalism, have a wonderful curriculum that they're putting together. And people over at the Poor People's Campaign, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, has run an excellent 4-week series on this. He's going to be one of our guests next week, and their curriculum we're going to make available to you. So we're going to put together a number of assets and resources for you to use to continue these conversations and have ways to talk about this in your own communities. They're going to be helpful to you. So we're going to be building this as we go and dealing with the issue of civics and Christian schools and all of the complex issues that are going into all this. So I don't know, Stephany, if you have a final word, or if you're good for us just to go into Michael's final admonition, which is a little 7-minute long bit. But
I would just encourage people to come back. And if you can't make it every Tuesday at the same time, then know that this content will be made accessible and available. And it is about how do you begin to have conversations that you might not have had a pathway into before. And so thank you all for showing up tonight. And this is the beginning of our work. As Katherine said, we have to think about this as marathon runners and not sprinters.
Excellent. All right, here's Michael Waters. I think that you're going to find this a wonderful way to end our evening.
Friends, there is nothing new under the sun. Around midnight on October the 16th, 1915, William Joseph Simmons, a Methodist minister, ascended Stone Mountain in Georgia with 15 other men. He built there an altar to his God and laid upon it a Bible, a sword, and an American flag. A cross was also set ablaze. Hence, the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan was born. Reflecting later on that day, Reverend Simmons, who declared himself imperial wizard or national leader, said that the angels that have anxiously watched the Reformation from its beginnings must have hovered about Stone Mountain and shouted hosannas to the highest heavens. Simmons led the Klan for 7 years, during which time they experienced dramatic growth in number, influence, and power. In addition to facilitating other acts of violence all across America, the Klan gained majority control over several state houses and made public witness of their increasing influence and power by marching through the streets of Washington, D.C. Therefore, what is currently transpiring in America is not the first time that white Christian nationalism has run rampant, nor is it the first time that the God of white supremacy has been openly worshiped in both citadels of power as well as churches. Yet this truth does not diminish the clear and present dangers posed with its rise. You see, white supremacy comes with the body count. And when white Christian nationalism reigns, death runs rampant too. During the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of this year, many insurrectionists came, as the Klan did years before, to D.C. in the name of their God. They openly carried crosses and Bibles. They gathered for prayer in the shadow of gallows erected to lynch elected officials if granted the chance. They circled for prayer on the Senate floor after assaulting and murdering a Capitol police officer en route. They lauded their God for granting them the favor to, quote, send a message to all tyrants, the communists, and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs. Friends, we know that these are consequential times. Today, in the name of the God of white supremacy, voting rights are being eroded all across America. Today, in the name of the God of white supremacy, our Asian American brothers and sisters are being assaulted and slaughtered in cold blood in America's streets. Although a new administration now occupies the White House, the God of white supremacy still reigns supreme in most state houses. Before we can effectively work to heal our divides in this nation, we must take full inventory of the roots from which they spring forth. In many ways, our divides are the results of idol worship. When the God of our allegiance is a manifestation of our unsubstantiated fears and selfish manipulations, we worship a God shaped and formed in our own interests, as opposed to the God who shaped and formed us as a reflection of God's self to care for the concerns of others. The author of the book of Ecclesiastes wrote, "History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new." Certainly, white Christian nationalism is not new. Our nation is unfortunately well acquainted with its death-dealing dynamics. But just as white Christian nationalism is not new, neither is our opposition to it. I must admit to you, friends, this truth for me is a well of hope. We are gifted with a blueprint for transformative struggle. In multiple generations before us, we find persons who have combated such evils with courage and consistency, persons brave enough to bend the arc towards justice, knowing that it does not just bend itself. Persons who bear witness to the light of God in the whole of humanity, who boldly work against any force seeking to diminish its light. The late Coretta Scott King once said, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation." Therefore, as in generations past, we must boldly, courageously, and consistently pick up the mantle of justice and advance the cause of freedom. We must advance the cause of freedom forward against what for us is a familiar foe. With faith in God and in community with each other, certainly in this generation, we will prevail.
That is the Reverend Dr. Michael Waters. You can find his contact information at michaelwaters.com. He is an author. He has three really great books out. Two that are written for adults and one that's written for children. It's called For Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World. It's a life-changing book for adults and children alike. We're so glad that you're with us tonight. Thanks for staying along the extra 7 minutes. We will look forward to seeing you back next week. Please share this webinar with others. We have your email addresses. We'll send you a copy of this. It's already on Facebook. This is being simulcast on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, so you can follow us in all those places. Please do. If you're not already connected to us over at Vote Common Good, please do. And if you want to be part of our movement, you want to help contribute, you want to help fund what we do, we would very much invite you to do that and to be part of this. We want to be able to provide this kind of training and these kinds of resources and connections for free. And we do that by people who make contributions to the work that we do. So please do consider being part of our efforts. And you can find all that over at Vote Common Good. You'll get a follow-up email if you're already on Zoom. If you're watching this on social media, you can go to votecommongood.com and sign up to be on the Zoom webinar for next week. And thank you so much. Thank you, Stephany. Good to see you, my friend. And Stephany and I will be joined next week by our third co-host, and it's going to, her name's Christy Berghoff, and it's going to be another one of these great weeks. And we'll be joined by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry and Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. It's going to be a very full week. So thank you for being with us, and we will see you next week.